Mr. President, on February 13th, the nation was shaken by the news that the Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia had passed away. Justice Scalia served on the nation's highest court for 29 years, and he was a major figure on the American legal landscape. Justice Scalia was described by Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circle as, quote, the most influential justice of the last quarter century. Over the years, I've come to know Justice Scalia. He was a man of great intellect, good humor, and he was a very social person. We certainly disagreed on many fundamental issues, but even those who disagreed with Justice Scalia on legal matters still admired him as a person. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, no ideological ally of Justice Scalia, wrote after his death, and I quote, "We were best buddies." She described him as, quote, a jurist of captivating brilliance and wit with a rare talent to make even the most sober judge laugh. Justice Ginsburg said she and Justice Scalia were different in our interpretation of written text, but they were one in our reverence for the Constitution and the institution we serve. I have great respect for the decades Justice Scalia has spent in public service. My thoughts and prayers clearly go with his family. As surprised as I was by the news of Justice Scalia's passing, I was amazed at how quickly the Senate Majority Leader, Senator McConnell of Kentucky, issued a press release saying, quote, this vacancy should not be filled until we have a new president. It was within 90 minutes of the press report of the justice passing. This statement clearly came at a time when most people were reflecting on the loss of the Supreme Court justice. And just like that, the conversation shifted to from the passing of an American legal giant to an attack on President Obama's authority to fill his vacancy on the Supreme Court. Now, what does the Constitution tell us about filling a vacancy on the Supreme Court? You know, there are very few oaths you take in life, and as members of the Senate, we swear each time we are sworn into a term here to uphold and defend that Constitution. What does the Constitution say about a vacancy on the Supreme Court? If you'll go to Article 2, Section 2, it is explicit and very simple. The President, quote, shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court, end of quote. So the President, under the Constitution, has an express responsibility to submit to the Senate the nomination of a person who is qualified to serve on our nation's highest court. And then, of course, the Senate has a job to do. Give that nominee a fair hearing and a timely vote. This is our responsibility, constitutional responsibility as United States senators. This is what we have been elected to do. Aside from voting on a declaration of war, I believe there's no greater responsibility than voting on the confirmation of a Supreme Court nominee. I serve on the Judiciary Committee, and it's been my privilege and honor to consider the nominations of 4 of the current Supreme Court justices. There is no question that we have the time remaining to meet our constitutional responsibility in a thoughtful, careful way. It is now February of 2016. We're almost a year away from January of 2017, when President Obama will officially leave office. The Republican leader would have us leave a seat on the nation's highest court vacant for at least 1 year. Not since the Civil War has the Senate taken longer than a year to fill a Supreme Court vacancy, and it certainly shouldn't happen now. Usually it takes the Senate about 2 months to consider a Supreme Court nominee. Senator Leahy, the ranking Democrat on Judiciary, said on average it's about 67 days. So we have more than enough time to do this in a thoughtful and responsible way. Even during presidential election years, the Senate has routinely confirmed Supreme Court justices. It happened over a dozen times. Most recently, 1988, when Justice Anthony Kennedy was confirmed by a 97-0 vote in President Reagan's final year in office. President Reagan was leaving office, Republican president, an election was coming. He submitted a name, Justice Kennedy, to the Supreme Court, and a Democratic-controlled Senate approved it 97-0. So to argue this has never happened before is to ignore history and even recent history. In the past, Senate Republican leaders have said that the confirmation process should move forward with as little time as a month before an election. Consider the presidential election of 1968. On June 13th of that year, Chief Justice Earl Warren informed the president he wanted to step down. On June 26th of the election year, Johnson nominated Associate Justice Abe Fortas to become Chief Justice and nominated Judge Homer Thornberry to fill his seat. President Johnson had already announced he would not run again, but Senate Republican leaders did not call President Johnson a lame duck and question his right to put forward nominees. In fact, Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen of my state of Illinois said on July 13th of that year, quote, "I find that term lame duck as applied to the President of the United States as an entirely improper and offensive term." Republican Senator Dirksen referring to the lame duck status of President Lyndon Johnson, Democrat. The Senate gave the president's nominee a prompt hearing in the Judiciary Committee. As it turned out, the hearing ended up uncovering a range of ethics concerns about Justice Fortas, and in late September and early October, Senate Republicans filibustered his nomination. Fortas subsequently withdrew. But on October 3rd, same year, election year, just a month before the election, the New York Times reported that, quote, Senator Dirksen said there was still time for the president to submit a new name and rush it through the Senate before the Congress adjourned. Republican leader said even with a month left, try to fill the vacancy. This was a month before the presidential election. Where are the leaders like Everett Dirksen in today's Republican Party? Senators who are willing to roll up their sleeves and get down to the work of considering nominees on their merits so the Supreme Court could do its work? We have a constitutional responsibility, as does the president. Make no mistake, the Supreme Court needs a full complement of justices on the bench. When the court has an even number, as it does today, 4-4, important cases are increasingly likely to end up in a tie vote. When that happens in a case, the ruling of the lower court stands, and it's like the Supreme Court never heard the case at all. Major legal and constitutional questions are constantly brought before the court. When the court is frozen at an even number of justices, many of those questions just go unresolved, and millions of Americans who are impacted by these questions have to wait. That's not fair to the American people. That's why historically the Senate has moved to fill vacancies on the court. And that's why so many Americans are troubled by Senate Republicans' call for a one-year hiatus in filling the Supreme Court vacancy. Former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said in an interview last week she disagreed with the idea of waiting for the next president to appoint a new justice. Justice O'Connor said, quote, "We need somebody there now to do the job. Let's get on with it," end of quote. I agree with Justice O'Connor. When President Obama submits a nominee, which he'll do in the coming days, the Senate needs to do its job, its constitutional responsibility, to give that nominee a fair hearing and a timely vote. My Republican colleagues can choose to vote for or against the nominee. That is their prerogative, but they should not simply duck the vote. We weren't elected to this job to ignore important issues. We were elected to cast votes on important issues. This is too important an issue to simply ignore. And when it comes to giving the president's nominee a fair hearing, I certainly hope that the Senate Republicans don't adopt the Donald Trump position. When asked last week about the president's nomination, Mr. Trump, as he is wont to do, gave us a juicy quote. Here's what he said: "I think it's up to Mitch McConnell and everybody else to stop it. It's called delay, delay, delay." I'm sure the Senate Republicans were not happy with that statement by Trump, but he did speak for a number of people who believe that that is the right strategy. Stop the president from using his constitutional authority. Stop the Senate from accepting its constitutional responsibility. I hope my Republican colleagues don't follow Mr. Trump's lead and try to stop President Obama's nominee through endless delays. No one's going to be fooled if Senate Republicans spend weeks haggling over unreasonable document requests or swamping the nominee with endless written questions. Mr. Trump has already made it clear that delay, delay, delay is simply a strategy to stop the seat from being filled. If Republicans delay in an effort to run out the clock, we will know it. The American people will know it. The American people want us to act. They want us to accept our constitutional responsibility. It's time for us to get down to work and do our job. The Senate can't afford to sit on its hands for 1 year and leave the Supreme Court hanging in the balance. When President Obama names a nominee, I urge my Republican colleagues to give that person a fair hearing and a timely vote.